Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the leather journal, its pages brittle with age and spotted with moisture stains. Frank's heavy breathing behind her was the only sound competing with the relentless drumming of rain against the storage facility's corrugated roof. Murphy had stopped whimpering, but his low growl suggested whatever had spooked him hadn't gone away. "Maybe we should take this home first," Frank said, his voice tight with unease. "Look at it properly in good light." Margaret barely heard him. Her reading glasses had fogged from the unit's humid air, but she could still make out the spidery handwriting on the first page, property of Dr. Edmund Thorne, 1984. Below that, in the same careful script, Day 1, the tree responds to proximity. Notes on behavioral changes in subjects. "Margaret." Frank's hand settled on her shoulder. "We've been here 2 hours. The auction was supposed to be a fun afternoon, remember? Something to get us out of the house." She looked up at her husband of 34 years, noting the worry lines that had deepened around his eyes since his retirement from the postal service. Frank had always been her anchor, the practical counterweight to her obsessive nature. When she'd lost herself in research projects that stretched into sleepless weeks, he'd been the one to pull her back to earth with gentle reminders about meals and sleep and the world beyond her microscope. But this was different. This challenged everything. "Frank, look at this tree again. Really look at it." She gestured toward the bonsai with the journal. "The bark hasn't grown around the finger. It's grown through it. The cellular structure has somehow incorporated human tissue without rejection or decay. This is impossible." Frank squinted at the small tree, its twisted branches casting strange shadows in the dim light filtering through the storage unit's single bare bulb. "Honey, you've been retired for 3 years. Maybe it's time to let someone else worry about impossible things." Margaret had heard this before. After decades of cataloguing plant specimens, publishing papers on rare Pacific Northwest flora, and teaching graduate courses at Oregon State, she was supposed to be content with her greenhouse and her vegetable garden. She was supposed to find fulfillment in the local garden club's monthly meetings and the Historical Society's plant walks. But retirement had felt like slow suffocation. Every morning she woke with the same restless energy that had driven her through graduate school and her early career, only now there was nowhere to direct it. Frank puttered happily with his woodworking projects, content to build birdhouses and repair neighbors' fences. Margaret envied his peace, even as it mystified her. "Day 12, she read aloud from the journal, flipping past several dense pages of notes. Subject showing increased agitation. Refuses to approach the specimen. Classic avoidance behavior despite no apparent stimulus." She looked up at Murphy, who had positioned himself near the storage unit's entrance, as far from the tree as possible. "What do you think he's sensing?" "He's an old dog in a strange place during a thunderstorm," Frank said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Can we please just load everything in the truck and sort it out at home?" Margaret closed the journal reluctantly. Frank was right, of course. The storage unit was cramped and poorly lit, hardly the place for proper examination. But something about the tree demanded immediate attention, as if it were somehow aware of their presence. They'd driven to the auction on a whim, drawn by Frank's suggestion that they needed a treasure-hunting adventure. Margaret had imagined finding vintage gardening tools, or perhaps an interesting plant specimen. She hadn't expected to feel this familiar surge of scientific curiosity, the same electric anticipation that had sustained her through years of research. "Just help me understand the context first," she said, opening the journal again. "If this Dr. Thorne documented his observations, maybe—" A sharp crack interrupted her. They both looked toward the tree, but it sat motionless on its shelf. Murphy's growl intensified. "That was just the building settling," Frank said, but he stepped closer to Margaret. "Old metal in a storm." Margaret nodded, though the sound had seemed to come from much closer. She forced herself to close the journal and slip it into her jacket pocket. Frank was trying to be patient, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward the exit. 23 years of marriage to a botanist had taught him to recognize when Margaret was about to disappear into an obsession. He'd supported her through countless late-night research sessions, weekend field trips and conference presentations, but he'd also watched her lose herself in work that consumed everything else. "You're right," she said finally. "Let's get everything loaded." But even as she helped Frank wrap the bonsai carefully in an old blanket, Margaret's mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities waiting in those journal pages. The tree felt almost warm through the fabric, its weight somehow greater than its small size should have allowed. Murphy barked once, sharp and urgent, before reluctantly following them toward the truck. The drive home through the winding roads of rural Oregon gave Margaret time to study Frank's profile in the dashboard light. His jaw was set in that particular way that meant he was wrestling with something he didn't want to say. After 34 years of marriage, she could read his moods like weather patterns, and right now storm clouds were gathering. "You're thinking about the greenhouse incident," she said as they turned into their gravel driveway. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I'm thinking about a lot of things." The greenhouse incident. Even 3 years later, neither of them spoke about it directly. How Margaret had become so consumed with a rare orchid's unusual root system that she'd forgotten to eat for 2 days, forgotten their anniversary dinner, forgotten that Frank existed at all. He'd found her collapsed among the specimen tables at 2 in the morning, dehydrated and muttering about cellular mutations that made no botanical sense. "This is different," Margaret said quietly. "Is it?" Frank parked beside their modest craftsman-style house, the headlights illuminating the neat flower beds that had become her retirement project. Rows of carefully labeled perennials, organized by bloom time and soil requirements. Safe, predictable, thoroughly catalogued, because it feels exactly the same. Murphy had recovered his composure during the drive and now waited eagerly by the tailgate, his golden retriever instincts overriding whatever had spooked him at the storage unit. Margaret watched him sniff curiously at the truck bed, then take a deliberate step backward when his nose reached the blanket-wrapped tree. Their house welcomed them with warm light spilling from the kitchen windows. Margaret had left the porch light on, a habit from decades of Frank coming home after dark from his postal routes. Everything about their evening routine was designed for comfort. Frank's reading chair positioned just so beside the fireplace, Margaret's botanical journals stacked neatly on the coffee table, Murphy's bed in the corner where he could keep watch over both of them. This was what she had to lose, Margaret realized, as they carried boxes and miscellaneous items from the auction into their living room. Not just Frank's patience or their comfortable retirement, but this carefully constructed piece they'd built together. Frank had earned his contentment after 35 years of 6-day work weeks and early morning shifts. He deserved a wife who could share quiet evenings and Sunday morning crosswords without disappearing into obsessions that left no room for anything else. But as Frank set the wrapped bonsai carefully on their dining table, Margaret felt that familiar electricity singing through her nerves. When had she last felt truly alive? When had she last encountered something that challenged everything she thought she understood about the natural world? "I'll make coffee," Frank said, heading toward the kitchen. "Then we can look at your tree properly." Your tree, not a tree or a tree. Frank was already distancing himself from whatever this might become. Margaret unwrapped the bonsai slowly, revealing its twisted trunk and the impossible flesh embedded in its bark. In the warm light of their dining room, surrounded by familiar furniture and family photos, the tree looked even more unsettling. The finger seemed almost fresh, the wedding ring catching light like a tiny beacon. Murphy padded into the room and froze when he saw the unwrapped tree. His tail dropped, and he backed away until he reached the kitchen doorway. "Easy, boy," Margaret murmured, but she understood his reaction. Something about the tree felt wrong in their peaceful home, like a discordant note in a familiar melody. Frank returned with 2 steaming mugs, his movements deliberately calm. This was how he'd handled her obsessions before, with patience and coffee and gentle reminders about the world beyond her fixations. "So what do you think we have here?" Margaret pulled the journal from her jacket pocket, noting how Frank's expression tightened when he saw it. "Dr. Thorne documented everything. behavioral observations, physical changes in the tree, notes about previous owners. She opened to a page near the middle. Listen to this. Day 28. The Hendersons have stopped answering their door. Neighbors report no activity for 3 days. The specimen's root system has expanded significantly. Margaret Frank set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. We don't know anything about this, Dr. Thorne. This could be fiction, or the ramblings of someone with mental health issues. But Margaret was already turning pages, her scientific mind cataloguing patterns and anomalies. The handwriting remained consistent throughout, the observations detailed and methodical. Whatever Dr. Thorne had been, he'd approached his research with the same systematic rigor Margaret recognized in her own work. The documentation spans 4 decades, she said, multiple owners, multiple incidents. She looked up at Frank, seeing her own reflection in his worried eyes. This isn't random, Frank. There's a pattern here. Outside, the October storm continued its assault on their windows, but inside their warm house, something had shifted. The comfortable routine of their retirement felt suddenly fragile, like ice beginning to crack under unexpected weight. Frank reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Whatever this is, promise me we'll approach it carefully. Together. Margaret nodded, though her gaze was already drifting back to the journal's dense pages of notes. Margaret promised, but her fingers were already tracing the journal's next entry. Day 32. Henderson property shows signs of abandonment. Weeds growing through porch boards at impossible rate. The specimen has added approximately 2 inches to its primary trunk diameter. Frank squeezed her hand tighter. Margaret, look at me. She forced herself to meet his eyes, seeing decades of shared mornings and quiet evenings reflected there. Frank's weathered face held the same expression he'd worn during her darkest research obsessions. Love tempered by fear, patience stretched thin by experience. I hear you, she said, closing the journal with effort. Together. But even as she spoke, Margaret felt the familiar pull of discovery tugging at her consciousness. The tree sat between them on the table like an accusation, its impossible anatomy challenging everything she'd learned in 4 decades of botanical study. Her retirement had been a slow death of curiosity, each peaceful day another small burial of the drive that had once defined her. Now, suddenly, she felt awake again. Frank studied her face, reading the signs he knew too well. Why don't we start with something simple? See if we can identify the species, maybe research basic care requirements? It was a reasonable suggestion, the kind of measured approach that had kept their marriage stable through years of Margaret's academic intensity. But as she nodded agreement, a sharp tap, tap, tap echoed through the house. Murphy jumped to his feet, alert but not alarmed. Just someone at the door, Frank said, rising from his chair. Probably the Hendersons checking if we lost power. Margaret froze. Did you say Henderson? Frank paused halfway to the front door, confusion creasing his forehead. The Hendersons? Our neighbors? Margaret, you know them. Bill and Sarah, 3 houses down? The tapping came again, more insistent. Through their front window, Margaret could see a dark figure hunched against the storm, but the porch light created more shadows than illumination. Frank! Margaret's voice came out strangled. She flipped frantically through journal pages, scanning dates and locations. What's their address? Bill and Sarah Henderson? 4247 Clearwater Road. Frank's hand froze on the doorknob. Why? Margaret found the entry, her finger trembling as she traced the precise handwriting. The Hendersons, 4247 Clearwater Road. Day 35. Property inspection confirms fears. No signs of recent habitation. Mailbox overflowing. The specimen now exhibits unprecedented growth patterns. The tapping shifted to knocking, deliberate and rhythmic. Murphy whined and backed toward the kitchen, his instincts apparently overriding his training to greet visitors. Margaret, that was written 40 years ago, Frank said, but his voice carried uncertainty. It has to be a coincidence. Different Hendersons. She kept reading, her scientific mind rejecting what her eyes showed her. Day 40, local authorities found no trace of the Henderson family. House sold at auction 6 weeks later. New owners lasted 11 days before abandoning the property. The specimen has begun producing unusual seed pods. The knocking stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Margaret could hear only the storm's wind and her own heartbeat thundering against her ribs. Frank turned the porch light brighter and peered through the window's edge. "I don't see anyone." He looked back at Margaret, who was still staring at the journal with horrified fascination. Probably just someone seeking shelter who moved on. But Margaret had found something else, a hand-drawn map tucked between journal pages, showing property boundaries and addresses along Clearwater Road. Their own house was marked with a small X and a notation, purchased 1987, M and F Chen. Specimen relocated 2.3 miles. Monitor for proximity effects. "Frank." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Dr. Thorne knew about us. He knew we'd live here." Frank crossed the room in 3 quick strides and looked over her shoulder at the map. She watched his face change as he processed the implications, saw the exact moment when his protective skepticism cracked. "That's impossible," he said, but without conviction. Margaret turned to the final pages of the journal, finding entries that made her blood freeze. The Chen woman will be drawn to the specimen. Her academic background makes her particularly susceptible to its influence. She must be allowed to complete the documentation. The cycle requires willing participation. The room felt suddenly colder, as if the storm outside had found its way through their walls. Margaret looked at the bonsai sitting innocently on their dining table, its embedded finger catching light from the overhead fixture. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw the ring pulse like a tiny heartbeat. Murphy barked once, sharp and urgent, staring toward the front window. Margaret faced a choice that would define everything that came after. She could close the journal, wrap the tree back in its blanket, and pretend this was all an elaborate coincidence. Return to her peaceful retirement, her catalogued garden, her safe and predictable days. Or she could admit that something impossible had entered their ordinary world, something that demanded investigation despite the cost. She opened the journal to the first blank page and reached for a pen. Frank's hand covered hers. Before the pen could touch paper, his weathered fingers surprisingly strong as he pressed her palm flat against the journal's blank page. "Stop." His voice carried a weight Margaret hadn't heard in years, the same tone he'd used when he found her collapsed in the greenhouse. "Just stop for a moment and think about what you're doing." Margaret felt the familiar surge of irritation that came when someone interrupted her research flow. "I'm documenting, Frank. That's what scientists do. We observe, we record, we analyze." "No." Frank pulled the pen gently from her grip. "What scientists do is protect themselves from contaminated samples. They establish safety protocols before engaging with unknown variables." He gestured toward the bonsai, its embedded finger seeming to glisten in the dining room light. "Does this look like something we should engage with directly?" The rational part of Margaret's mind, the part that had guided her through decades of careful research, acknowledged his point. But a deeper current pulled at her consciousness, the same magnetic force that had drawn her to botany in the first place. How many scientific breakthroughs had been lost to excessive caution? How many researchers had let fear override discovery? "You read the journal," she said, her voice taking on the measured tone she'd once used with difficult graduate students. "Dr. Thorne observed these phenomena for 40 years. If there was immediate danger—" Dr. Thorne disappeared. Frank's interruption was sharp, uncharacteristic, along with multiple families, according to his own notes. "That's not scientific progress, Margaret. That's a pattern of people getting hurt." Murphy padded closer to the table, then stopped just outside some invisible boundary, his golden fur bristling along his spine. The dog's reaction troubled Margaret more than she wanted to admit. Animals often sensed environmental changes humans missed. Electromagnetic shifts, chemical emissions, subsonic vibrations. Whatever Murphy was detecting, It was triggering deep-rooted survival instincts. Margaret looked around their dining room, really seeing it for the first time that evening. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, their wedding day, camping trips in the Cascades, Frank's retirement party 3 years ago. The comfortable detritus of a long marriage filled every corner, his reading glasses on the side table, her botanical magazine stacked beside the window, Murphy's favorite tennis ball gathering dust under the china cabinet. This was what she risked losing. Not just Frank's support, but the peace they'd fought so hard to build. Her obsessions hadn't just threatened her health, they'd nearly destroyed their marriage. The greenhouse incident was only the most dramatic example of how her need to understand could consume everything else in her life. "What if we called someone?" Frank suggested, his tone carefully neutral. "Oregon State has a botany department. Maybe Dr. Williams could recommend someone who specializes in unusual specimens." Margaret almost laughed. "What would I tell them? That we found a tree with a human finger growing through its bark? That it came with a journal documenting 40 years of mysterious disappearances?" She shook her head. "They'd recommend psychiatric evaluation, not botanical consultation." "Then maybe we should listen to that recommendation." Frank's words hung in the air like a challenge. Maybe the rational response to impossible things is to walk away. The suggestion felt like physical pain. Margaret had spent her entire career pushing against the boundaries of accepted knowledge, investigating plants that thrived in impossible conditions, documenting species that shouldn't exist in their recorded habitats. Science advanced through engagement with anomalies, not retreat from them. But Frank was right about the dangers. Even without supernatural explanations, the tree represented unknown variables. The organic matter embedded in its bark could carry pathogens, toxins, or parasites. The previous owner's disappearances might have rational explanations: chemical contamination, psychological manipulation, coordinated fraud. A responsible researcher would establish safety protocols before proceeding. 3 days, Margaret said finally. "Give me 3 days to research this properly. I'll contact the university, see if anyone in the botany department has encountered similar specimens. I'll research Dr. Thorne's background, try to verify his credentials, and I'll document everything: environmental conditions, physical changes in the tree, behavioral observations." Frank's expression suggested this wasn't the compromise he'd hoped for. "And if you find evidence of danger? If the research points towards something we can't handle?" Margaret looked at the tree, its twisted branches casting intricate shadows across their dining table. The embedded finger seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, barely perceptible but definitely present. Every instinct she developed as a scientist screamed that this specimen represented something unprecedented, possibly revolutionary. "Then we'll call the authorities," she said, knowing she was lying. "We'll turn everything over to people with better resources and walk away." Frank studied her face, reading the truth she couldn't quite hide. He'd learned to recognize her promises the same way she read botanical classifications, carefully with full awareness of subtle variations that could mean everything. 3 days, he said finally, "but we establish ground rules. No touching the tree directly, no solo investigation, and the moment something feels dangerous, we stop." Margaret nodded, already planning how to begin her documentation. Outside, the storm continued its assault on their windows, but inside their warm house, she felt the familiar electricity of discovery singing through her nervous system. She didn't notice Murphy retreating to the far corner of the room, or the way the embedded finger seemed to pulse faster in response to her excitement. Margaret woke before dawn with her mind already racing through research protocols. Frank slept beside her, his breathing steady and peaceful, but she could feel the weight of their agreement pressing against her consciousness like a physical thing. 3 days. She had 3 days to unlock a mystery that Dr. Thorne had spent 40 years documenting. She slipped from bed without disturbing Frank and padded downstairs in her robe, drawn by an inexplicable need to check on the tree. In the grey pre-dawn light filtering through their dining room windows, the bonsai looked different, more vibrant somehow, its leaves holding a subtle luminescence that seemed impossible in the dim morning shadows. Margaret forced herself to stop 3 feet from the table, remembering Frank's ground rules about direct contact. But even from this safe distance, she could see new details that her scientific mind catalogued automatically. Tiny root tendrils emerging from the pot's drainage holes, microscopic buds forming along previously bare branches, and something that made her breath catch. The embedded finger appeared to have shifted position slightly, as if the hand was slowly curling into a fist. She grabbed a notebook from the kitchen and began her first official documentation, sketching the tree's current configuration and noting environmental conditions. Temperature, 68 degrees. Humidity, moderate due to storm aftermath. Light exposure, minimal natural light. No artificial illumination during night hours. The act of recording calmed her, providing familiar structure around the impossible. When Frank emerged an hour later, already dressed and carrying 2 cups of coffee, Margaret had filled 6 pages with observations, measurements, and preliminary hypotheses. He found her sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by botanical reference books she'd pulled from storage. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, though his tone suggested he'd known exactly where he'd find her. "I kept thinking about root growth patterns," Margaret said, accepting her coffee gratefully. "Look at this." She showed him her sketches, pointing to the delicate tendrils emerging from the pot. "That's 12 hours of growth, Frank. No bonsai species grows that rapidly under normal conditions." Frank studied her drawings with the same careful attention he'd once brought to architectural blueprints. "What about abnormal conditions? Fertilizers, growth hormones, genetic modification?" "Possible." Margaret flipped to a page covered with chemical formulations. "But the embedded organic matter complicates standard analysis. I need equipment we don't have. Soil pH testing, microscopic examination of the root structure, maybe even tissue samples from the..." She gestured toward the dining room, unable to say the word finger out loud. "The university," Frank said. "Dr. Williams might let you use the lab facilities." Margaret had already considered this, but the logistics felt overwhelming. How could she transport the tree safely? What explanation could she offer for its unusual characteristics? And underneath those practical concerns lurked a deeper reluctance she didn't want to examine too closely, the possessive feeling that this discovery belonged to her alone. "Let me try something else first," she said, pulling out her laptop. "Background research on Dr. Thorne, property records for previous owners, maybe even academic papers on unusual botanical specimens." Frank nodded, settling into his own morning routine of checking weather forecasts and local news. This domestic normalcy felt surreal with the impossible tree sitting 20 feet away, but Margaret found comfort in the familiar rhythm of their shared mornings. Her online searches yielded fragments that gradually assembled into a disturbing picture. Dr. Arthur Thorne had been a legitimate researcher. She found references to his early papers on symbiotic plant relationships and adaptive botany dating back to the 1970s. But his academic publications stopped abruptly in 1983 with no explanation or forwarding address listed in the university directories. Property records proved even more unsettling. The storage unit they'd purchased had belonged to the Whitmore estate, but the family had disappeared in 2019 after owning the tree for only 6 months. Before that, the Rodriguezes, 2018, family relocated suddenly. The Hartmans, 2016 to 2017, house sold at auction, and reaching further back, dozens of brief ownerships punctuated by unexplained departures. "Frank," Margaret's voice came out hoarse. "I found something." He turned the laptop toward him, showing a newspaper article from 1994, "Local family vanishes, rare plant collection left behind." The accompanying photo showed a modest house surrounded by elaborate gardens, and in the foreground, unmistakably, sat their bonsai tree. Frank read the article twice before speaking. "The Hendersons," he said quietly. "Same family mentioned in Dr. Thorne's journal." Margaret nodded. her hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through more search results. Every few years, the same pattern: new owners, brief period of apparent normalcy, then sudden disappearance or abandonment. The tree appeared in background photos spanning 3 decades, unchanged and unchanging. "We should call someone," Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Police, maybe, or—" And tell them what? Margaret's scientific training warred with growing dread. That we think a plant is responsible for missing persons cases spanning 40 years? They'd assume we're delusional. She looked toward the dining room, where morning sunlight was beginning to illuminate the tree's twisted branches. Something had drawn her to that storage auction. Something had guided her to bid on that particular unit. Dr. Thorne's journal suggested this wasn't coincidence, that she'd been selected somehow, chosen for her expertise and susceptibility. Margaret Chen, retired botanist with an obsessive need to catalogue everything around her, faced the defining choice of her scientific career. She could close the laptop, wrap the tree back up, and try to return it somehow. Or she could acknowledge that she'd already crossed into territory where normal rules didn't apply, where her comfortable retirement had ended the moment she'd opened that storage unit door. She reached for Dr. Thorne's journal and opened it to the first blank page. This time, Frank didn't stop her when she began to write. Day 1, First Entrim Chen, October 15, 6:47 a.m. Initial observations confirm accelerated growth patterns inconsistent with known bonsai species. Root emergence through drainage holes measures 2.3 centimeters in 12 hours. Embedded organic matter appears to shift position during observation periods. Frank suggests contamination protocols, but traditional safety measures feel inadequate given the specimen's unique characteristics. Margaret paused, pen hovering over the page. Dr. Thorne's journal entries had started similarly, clinical, measured, rooted in scientific methodology. She wondered at what point his documentation had shifted from observation to obsession. Frank cleared his throat behind her. "What's your hypothesis?" "Too early for hypotheses," Margaret replied, though her mind was already racing through possibilities. "I need more data points." She was interrupted by her phone buzzing against the kitchen counter. The caller ID showed OSU Botany Dept, Dr. Sarah Williams, her former colleague, and the only person she'd contacted about the tree. "Margaret?" Sarah's voice carried concern even through the phone's speaker. "I got your voicemail about unusual specimens. Are you all right?" "Frank mentioned you'd been under stress lately." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Of course Frank had called Sarah. Her breakdown 3 years ago wasn't exactly a secret among her academic circle. "I'm fine, Sarah. This is purely professional curiosity." "About a tree with organic matter embedded in its bark?" Sarah's tone shifted to careful professionalism. "Margaret, that sounds like evidence of trauma or disease. You should contact plant pathology, maybe even animal control if there's been contamination." Through the kitchen doorway, Margaret could see morning sunlight striking the tree's twisted branches, illuminating details she hadn't noticed before. The embedded finger appeared to have fingernails, perfect, manicured, with what looked like traces of pale polish. "Could you recommend someone discreet?" Margaret asked. "Someone who might examine unusual specimens without immediately involving authorities." The silence stretched long enough for Margaret to wonder if the call had dropped. Finally, Sarah spoke carefully. "There's a graduate student, James Chen. No relation, I assume. He specializes in plant anomalies, does consulting work for private collectors. But Margaret, if you've found something dangerous, I'll be careful." Margaret was already writing down the name. "Could you send me his contact information?" After ending the call, she found Frank watching her with the expression he'd worn during her worst research binges. Patient concern mixed with growing frustration. "You promised to involve experts," he said. "James Chen is an expert, and Sarah vouches for his discretion." Margaret returned to the journal, adding notes about the specimen's apparent response to light exposure. This way, we get professional analysis without triggering bureaucratic overreactions. Frank poured himself more coffee, a sure sign he was preparing for extended negotiations. What happens if this expert tells us the tree is dangerous? If he recommends destroying it or turning it over to authorities? Margaret's pen stilled against the page. The question touched something deeper than scientific curiosity, a territorial instinct she recognized but couldn't explain. The tree had chosen her somehow, trusted her with its secrets. Destroying it felt like betrayal. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we reach it," she said, knowing the answer wasn't enough. Frank's phone rang before he could respond, his contractor's ringtone cutting through the morning quiet. Margaret half listened to his conversation about delayed supply deliveries and rescheduled installations while she continued documenting. But when Frank's tone shifted to confusion, then alarm, her attention sharpened. "Are you sure about that address?" Frank was saying. "When did this happen?" Margaret looked up from the journal to find Frank staring toward the dining room, his face pale. "What is it?" she asked, as he ended the call. "That was Jim Morrison, the guy who runs storage auctions in the county." Frank set his phone down carefully. "He said someone came asking about our unit yesterday, wanted to know who'd purchased it, what we'd found inside." "What kind of someone?" He couldn't say exactly. Middle-aged man, well-dressed, very persistent, offered cash for information about the contents. Frank's voice dropped. Jim said there was something off about him, the way he talked about the tree specifically, like he'd been looking for it. Margaret felt ice spreading through her veins. Dr. Thorne's journal had mentioned others, people who tracked the tree's movements, who understood its significance. She'd assumed they were part of his paranoid fantasies, but what if they were real? Did Jim give him our information? No. But Margaret... Frank gestured helplessly toward the journal in her hands. "How many people know where that tree ends up? How long before someone comes looking for it here?" Before Margaret could answer, Murphy began barking from the living room, sharp, urgent barks that meant strangers approaching. Through their front windows, she could see a silver sedan pulling into their driveway, moving slowly like the driver was checking house numbers. Margaret closed the journal and stood, her scientific excitement crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. If someone wanted her tree, they'd have to explain why first. Margaret moved to the front window, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The silver sedan idled in their driveway, engine running, windshield tinted too dark to make out the driver's features. Murphy's barking intensified, his hackles raised in a way she'd only seen when he encountered genuinely threatening strangers. "Stay here," Frank said, moving toward the door, but Margaret caught his arm. "No." Her voice carried an authority that surprised them both. "We need to know what we're dealing with first." She retrieved Dr. Thorne's journal from the kitchen table, her mind racing through the entries about others who sought the tree. Thorne had written about them with increasing paranoia. Shadowy figures who appeared whenever the tree changed hands, people who seemed to understand its significance better than its temporary owners ever could. The car door opened with a soft click that somehow carried through their closed windows. A man emerged, middle-aged, as Jim had described, wearing an expensive-looking dark coat despite the mild October weather. He moved with deliberate care, like someone accustomed to being watched, scanning their property with methodical precision before approaching the front door. "He knows we're watching," Margaret whispered, noting how the stranger's gaze lingered on each window, cataloguing sight lines and potential escape routes. Frank had his phone out, finger hovering over 911. "Should I call?" The doorbell rang, followed immediately by 3 measured knocks. Not the urgent pounding of someone in distress, but the patient rhythm of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary. Margaret found herself moving toward the front door before consciously deciding to do so. Behind her, Frank hissed a warning, but she was already turning the deadbolt, journal clutched against her chest like armor. The man on their doorstep looked entirely ordinary. Pleasant features, graying hair, the kind of forgettable face that belonged in bank lobbies or insurance offices. but his eyes held the same focused intensity Margaret recognized in her own reflection when she was deep in research. This was someone who studied things, catalogued them, understood their significance. "Dr. Chen," he said, voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "My name is David Marsh. I believe you've acquired something that belongs to my family. I don't know what you're talking about." The lie came easily, but Marsh's slight smile suggested he heard it for what it was. "The Whitmore storage unit, lot 847. You purchased it 3 days ago along with all contents." His gaze moved past her toward the interior of their house, searching. "I'm particularly interested in a bonsai tree that was included among those contents." Frank appeared beside her, phone still in his hand. "How did you get our address?" Marsh's attention shifted to Frank with the same cataloguing intensity. "Public records, Mr. Chen. Storage auction purchases are documented transactions, though I admit Jim Morrison was less cooperative than I'd hoped when I tried to confirm the details." Margaret's grip tightened on the journal. This man knew too much, moved too confidently through information that should have taken days to compile. "What's your connection to the tree?" "It's been in my family for generations," Marsh said, and something in his tone suggested this wasn't entirely true. "Passed down through various relatives, though not always through conventional inheritance. Sometimes it finds its way to new caretakers when the previous ones are no longer able to maintain it properly." The euphemism sent ice through Margaret's veins. Dr. Thorne's journal documented dozens of families who'd become unable to maintain the tree, always through disappearance or abandonment, never through natural death or normal sale. "Do you have documentation proving ownership?" Frank's contractor training kicked in, demanding paperwork and legal clarity. Marsh reached slowly into his coat pocket, movements deliberate enough to avoid triggering alarm. He withdrew a manila envelope, offering it to Margaret. Provenance records dating back to 1978. Bills of sale, insurance documents, even some academic papers about its unique characteristics. Margaret accepted the envelope but didn't open it, sensing this was a crucial moment. Whatever decision she made now would determine whether she continued down the path Dr. Thorne had walked, or whether she stepped back into the safety of normal life. "I'd need time to review these documents," she said carefully, "and I'd want to verify their authenticity through proper channels." Marsh nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be staying at the Hillside Inn while I wait for your decision." He paused, studying her face with that same cataloguing intensity. "Though I should mention, Dr. Chen, that the tree doesn't respond well to prolonged separation from people who understand its needs. Previous caretakers have found it becomes restless when it feels abandoned." Behind her, Murphy's barking had stopped entirely. Margaret glanced back to see their dog pressed against the far wall of the living room, trembling. From the dining room came a sound she'd never heard before, a soft creaking, like branches moving in wind that didn't exist. When she turned back to the doorway, Marsh was already walking toward his car, moving with the same unhurried confidence that suggested he had all the time in the world. Margaret closed the door with trembling hands, the manila envelope heavy against her chest. The sound of Marsh's engine fading down their street felt like the last echo of her old life disappearing. Frank stood frozen beside her, both of them listening to the impossible creaking that continued to emanate from the dining room. "We need to look," Margaret whispered, though every instinct screamed against it. They moved together through their own house like intruders, Murphy trailing at a distance with his tail tucked low. The creaking grew louder as they approached the dining room, accompanied by a sound like rustling leaves that made no sense indoors. Margaret rounded the corner first and stopped so abruptly that Frank collided with her back. The tree had doubled in size. Where yesterday it had been a modest bonsai requiring both hands to lift, now it sprawled across their dining table like a miniature forest. New branches twisted upward in impossible spirals, and the root system had completely burst through the ceramic pot, spreading across the table's surface in thick, gnarled coils. The embedded finger was no longer partially hidden. It protruded obscenely from the trunk, the wedding ring gleaming as if recently polished. "This isn't possible," Frank breathed, but Margaret was already moving closer, Dr. Thorne's journal clutched against her racing heart. She forced herself to catalogue what she observed, clinging to scientific methodology even as reality crumbled around her. The new growth showed no signs of stress or strain that would accompany such rapid expansion. The bark remained healthy, almost lustrous. Most disturbing of all, she could see what looked like veins pulsing beneath the surface, not the simple xylem and phloem of normal trees, but something that resembled a circulatory system. "Margaret," Frank's voice carried a warning she'd never heard before. "Look at the base." The root system wasn't just spreading across the table, it was growing down into the wood itself, boring through solid oak as if it were soft earth. Thin tendrils had already reached the floor and were beginning to spread beneath their feet toward the load-bearing walls of their home. Margaret opened Marsh's envelope with shaking hands, papers spilling across the remaining free space on the table, bills of sale dating back 40 years, each showing the same pattern: brief ownership periods, sudden transfers, abandoned property claims. But it was the academic papers that made her legs go weak. Dr. Arthur Thorne's research, officially published, documented everything she was witnessing. Accelerated growth triggered by proximity to new hosts, root systems that could integrate with existing structures. And buried in the technical language, a terrifying hypothesis about the tree's nutritional requirements. "Frank," she whispered, pointing to a passage highlighted in faded yellow ink. "It feeds on minerals from bone. The finger isn't embedded in the tree grew around it while it was still." She couldn't finish the sentence. Frank read over her shoulder, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. From behind them came the sound of their back door opening. They turned in unison to see Marsh entering their kitchen without invitation, moving with the same unhurried confidence he'd displayed outside. In daylight, his ordinary features seemed subtly wrong. Too symmetrical, too composed, like a mask designed to appear human. "I see you've discovered its remarkable growth rate," he said, glancing toward the dining room without surprise. "The tree responds to stress by seeking stronger foundations. Your table won't support it much longer. Get out!" Frank stepped forward, but Marsh raised a hand that somehow froze him mid-motion. "Dr. Chen, you're a scientist. You understand that some discoveries transcend normal ethical boundaries." Marsh's gaze fixed on Margaret with hypnotic intensity. "The tree has chosen you specifically. Your botanical expertise, your methodical nature, your recent isolation from the academic community, all perfect qualifications for what it needs." Margaret felt herself responding to his words despite her terror, the same compulsive fascination that had driven her to purchase the storage unit in the first place. What does it need? To complete its current growth cycle, to produce its harvest. Marsh gestured toward the journal in her hands. Dr. Thorne understood this. Each caretaker contributes to its development until it's ready to propagate. Then it moves on, carrying the essence of those who've nurtured it. The roots beneath Margaret's feet pulsed visibly now, spreading in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. She could feel them testing the structural integrity of her home, preparing to claim it entirely. "The people who disappeared," she said, pieces falling into horrifying alignment. "They're all still here, in the tree." Marsh nodded approvingly. Not gone, transformed, made part of something far greater than their individual lives could have achieved. Frank lunged toward the kitchen drawers, seeking anything that might serve as a weapon, but the roots erupting through the floorboards tangled around his ankles. Margaret watched in horror as her husband fell, his hands scrabbling against wood that was already beginning to pulse with that same arterial rhythm she'd observed in the tree. "Choose quickly, Dr. Chen," Marsh said softly. "Willing participation makes the process far more pleasant for everyone involved." Margaret dropped to her knees beside Frank, clawing at the root tendrils that had wrapped around his legs like living rope. The wood felt warm and slick under her fingers, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. Frank's face had gone white with pain as the roots tightened, drawing thin lines of blood through his jeans. "Stop this!" she screamed at Marsh, but the man merely watched with clinical interest, as if observing a particularly fascinating experiment. "The tree doesn't respond to emotional appeals, Dr. Chen," he said calmly. "Only to submission or resistance. Your husband's struggles are making it defensive." Margaret's fingernails tore as she tried to pry the roots loose, but more erupted from the floorboards around them. The geometric patterns spread outward like a living mandala, and she realized with growing horror that they were being systematically cut off from any escape route. The roots had already reached the doorways, creating barriers that writhed with predatory intelligence. Frank's breathing became labored as the tendrils crept higher, wrapping around his torso. "Margaret!" he gasped, reaching for her hand. "Run!" But there was nowhere to go. The dining room had transformed into an alien landscape of twisted growth, the table now completely consumed by the tree's expanding mass. Branches scraped against the ceiling, and she could hear plaster cracking as the root systems spread into the walls. Their home, their sanctuary of 30 years, was being devoured from within. Margaret's scientific mind catalogued each impossible detail, even as her world collapsed. The embedded finger had been joined by others, pale shapes emerging from the bark like drowning victims, breaking the surface of dark water. Rings and jewelry glinted among the gnarled wood, and she caught glimpses of what might have been teeth, fragments of bone, wisps of hair. Dr. Thorne had been right about everything. "You studied plant pathology," Marsh continued conversationally, stepping closer as the roots parted to create a path for him. "You understand how certain organisms can commandeer their host's biological functions. This specimen has simply evolved beyond the limitations of passive plant behavior." Frank's struggles weakened as the roots constricted further. Margaret could see his lips turning blue, could hear the wheeze of compressed airways. 43 years of marriage, their courtship through graduate school, the struggle to build careers, the quiet disappointment of childlessness transformed into deeper intimacy, the recent dream of peaceful retirement, all of it crumbling as she watched her husband being consumed by her own obsessive curiosity. "Please," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw, "take me instead." "It doesn't work that way." Marsh crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell something wrong about him. Not decay, but the absence of any scent at all, as if he weren't entirely real. "The tree requires willing participation from its primary host. Secondary subjects, like your husband, are simply nutrients for the transformation process." The journal lay scattered around them, its pages soaking up Frank's blood. Margaret's eyes fell on Dr. Thorne's final entries, the handwriting deteriorating into desperate scrawls. "Should have burned it when I had the chance. Should have starved it. Should have chosen my family over my pride." She understood now why Thorne had never destroyed the tree despite understanding its nature. The same compulsion that had driven her to bid on the storage unit, to bring it home, to study it obsessively. It wasn't scientific curiosity. It was the tree's influence, patient and inexorable, preparing her for this moment. Murphy appeared in the kitchen doorway, hackles raised, barking frantically at the root barriers. But as Margaret watched, the sound changed to a whimper of pain. Thin tendrils had emerged from the walls, wrapping around their dog's legs with the same methodical precision. "No," Margaret sobbed, watching the tree claim the last innocent member of their family. Murphy's terrified eyes found hers across the transformed room, and she saw in them the same bewildered trust he'd shown when they'd rescued him from the shelter. He'd trusted her to keep him safe, just as Frank had trusted her judgment about the storage unit. Marsh stood, brushing imaginary dust from his coat. "Dr. Thorne took nearly 3 weeks to accept the inevitable. I'm hoping your scientific background will make you more pragmatic." Margaret's hands found a shard of the broken ceramic pot, its edge sharp enough to draw blood from her palm. For a wild moment she considered using it as a weapon, but Marsh's amused expression told her he'd seen countless caretakers reach the same desperate conclusion. "The transformation preserves consciousness," he said softly. "Dr. Thorne can confirm this himself, if you'd like to speak with him." From deep within the tree's twisted trunk came a sound that might have been wind through branches, or might have been a human voice trying to form words. Margaret's grip on the ceramic shard loosened as she recognized the impossible truth. Everyone who had disappeared was still there, still aware, still suffering. Frank's struggles had stopped entirely. Margaret stared at Frank's motionless form, the ceramic shard falling from her numb fingers. His chest still rose and fell, but barely, and his eyes had taken on a glassy quality she recognized from her botanical studies, the look of a plant cutting, just beginning to wilt as its connection to life slowly severed. The sound from within the tree's trunk came again, more distinctly this time. Not wind, words. Dozens of voices layered together in a chorus of the absorbed, and she could distinguish Dr. Thorne's academic cadence beneath the symphony of the consumed. "Help, her," the words emerged like sap bleeding from wounded bark. "Don't let him." Margaret's scientific mind, the very trait that had brought her to this moment, suddenly crystallized around a single devastating realization. She looked at Marsh, really looked at him, and saw what her terror had prevented her from recognizing before. He cast no reflection in the chrome surface of her refrigerator. He left no footprints in the debris scattered across her floor. And most telling of all, the roots that wrapped around Frank and Murphy, that had grown through solid oak and concrete, that moved with predatory intelligence, they avoided Marsh entirely, not out of deference or alliance, but because there was nothing there for them to claim. "You're not real," Margaret whispered, the words tasting like revelation and ash. "You're not a person at all." Marsh's pleasant expression flickered, like a television signal momentarily losing reception. For just an instant, Margaret glimpsed something else underneath, a hollow space where a human consciousness should be, filled only with the tree's ancient hunger and an intelligence that had learned to mimic human speech and mannerisms across decades of feeding. "Very good, Dr. Chen," the thing wearing Marsh's face said, its voice now carrying harmonics that resonated from the tree itself, though the distinction is largely academic at this point. Margaret's mind raced through the implications. The bills of sale, the academic papers, the careful documentation of ownership transfers, all of it fabricated. The tree had no human accomplice. It was the accomplice, projecting this false guardian to manipulate each new caretaker through the illusion of choice and negotiation. "How long?" she asked, backing slowly toward the kitchen counter where Frank kept his tools. "How long have you been masquerading as different people?" "Since the beginning," Marsh that wasn't Marsh replied. "Since the first family found me in the Oregon wilderness in 1978. I learned that humans respond better to other humans, even artificial ones. Dr. Thorne particularly appreciated having someone to discuss his research with, even near the end." The chorus of voices from within the tree grew louder, more urgent. Margaret began to distinguish individual words, fragments of warning and encouragement from those who had fought this same battle and lost. But beneath their voices, she heard something else, a deeper sound, like the groaning of ship timbers under stress. The tree was struggling. Margaret's eyes snapped to the root system spreading across her floor. The geometric patterns had become erratic, sections withering even as others pushed aggressively outward. The rapid growth that had doubled the tree's size was taking a toll, burning through energy reserves faster than it could replenish them. "You're starving," she realized aloud. "That's why you need willing participation. Unwilling hosts don't provide enough spiritual energy to sustain the transformation. That's why Dr. Thorne lasted 3 weeks. You were trying to break him down, make him compliant, but it was killing you both." The Marsh projection's form wavered more visibly now, edges blurring like watercolor in rain. "Your husband and dog will sustain me temporarily. But yes, I require your cooperation to complete this cycle. The alternative is unpleasant for all involved. Margaret's hand found Frank's largest hammer hanging from its pegboard hook. The weight of it felt substantial, real, in a world gone mad with impossibility. What happens if I refuse? What happens if I make you take me by force? Then I weaken further with each failed absorption. Eventually, I become dormant again, waiting for the next caretaker to revive me. The projection's smile turned predatory despite its increasing instability. But your family dies regardless. At least cooperation ensures their consciousness survives within me. The voices from the tree surged again, and this time Margaret heard Dr. Thorne's words clearly. The fire door. Remember the fire door. Margaret's gaze snapped to the basement entrance beside the refrigerator. Frank's workshop below contained acetylene tanks for his metalworking hobby, stored near the old coal furnace they'd never bothered to remove. Dr. Thorne's journal had mentioned considering fire, choosing his family over his pride. The tree's consciousness, distributed between its physical form and the projection, couldn't monitor everything simultaneously. As marsh flickered and wavered, the roots around Frank loosened slightly. Margaret gripped the hammer tighter and made her choice. "You want willing participation?" she said, taking a step toward the basement door. "Let's discuss terms." The projection's eyes tracked Margaret's movement toward the basement door, but its flickering form betrayed its weakening state. She could see it struggling to maintain coherence, the tree's energy divided between sustaining the illusion and holding its captives. "Terms?" The thing wearing Marsh's face tilted its head with predatory interest. "I'm listening." Margaret kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "You said consciousness survives within you. Prove it. Let me speak to Dr. Thorne directly. Not just fragments, but a real conversation. If he tells me the experience is bearable, I'll cooperate willingly." She needed time. Time to think, to plan, to find the weakness Dr. Thorne's journal had hinted at. The basement door was only 3 steps away, but the roots covering the floor pulsed with awareness, ready to ensnare her the moment she made a run for it. The projection considered her request, its form stabilizing slightly as it focused. From the tree came a deeper groaning, and suddenly one voice rose above the chorus. Clear, distinct, unmistakably Dr. Arthur Thorne. "Margaret, is that you?" The voice carried the same academic precision she remembered from his papers, but underneath lay something that made her skin crawl. "You found my journal." "Dr. Thorne." Margaret forced herself to step closer to the dining room, to the twisted mass that had consumed her table. "Tell me what it's like. Tell me the truth." A sound that might have been laughter emerged from the bark. "The truth? The truth is that death would have been a mercy. We're not preserved, Margaret. We're digested, slowly. Our memories, our personalities, our loves and fears, all of it processed like nutrients. Some days I remember my wife's face. Other days I can only recall the tree's hunger." The marsh projection's pleasant mask slipped, revealing irritation. "Dr. Thorne is experiencing integration difficulties. Not everyone adapts as smoothly." "Shut up!" Thorne's voice cut through the false reassurance. "Margaret, listen to me. The fire door, you found it, didn't you? The basement?" Margaret's pulse quickened. "I found it." "Good. The tree fears flame more than anything. Not because it can't regenerate, because fire releases everything it's absorbed. Every consciousness, every stolen life all at once. It would rather starve than face that." The projection flickered violently, and the roots around Frank began to constrict again. "Dr. Thorne is confused," it said, voice distorting like a damaged recording. "Integration trauma often causes the acetylene tanks." Thorne continued desperately. "Hot enough to burn green wood, even wood this saturated with spiritual energy. But you have to get there first, and it knows what you're thinking now." Margaret felt the roots beneath her feet shift, beginning to rise through the floorboards. But something else was happening too. Murphy had stopped whimpering. The small terrier hung motionless in the grip of the tree's tendrils, but his eyes remained alert, intelligent, watching her. Understanding flooded through Margaret as she remembered their first day together. Murphy had been a behavioral rescue, traumatized by years of abuse before they'd adopted him. But he'd learned to trust again, learned to be patient, learned to wait for the right moment to act. He was waiting now. "You're right," Margaret said, raising her voice to address the projection directly. "I can't reach the basement. The roots would stop me before I made it halfway." She let the hammer fall from her hands, the sound echoing in the transformed room. "But I'm not the only one here who understands sacrifice." The marsh thing smiled triumphantly. "Finally, a rational decision. If you'll place your hands on the trunk, we can begin the integration process immediately." Margaret took a step toward the tree, then another. The roots parted to create a path, just as they had for the projection. She could feel the thing's hunger radiating from the bark, sense its eagerness after so many years of dormancy. "Just one more question," she said, close enough now to touch the twisted trunk. "Dr. Thorne mentioned his family. What happened to them?" From within the tree came a sound of pure anguish. "I fed them to it first." Thorne's voice broke with remembered horror. I convinced myself it would be quick, merciful, that I could protect them somehow from inside. But there is no protection, Margaret. Only endless consumption." The projection's form was solidifying again, drawing strength from Margaret's proximity to the tree. "Enough conversation. Place your hands." "Murphy," Margaret said quietly. "Now." The terrier's jaws snapped down on the root holding him, his teeth finding something vital. The tree's scream shattered every piece of glassware in the kitchen as Murphy tore free, his small body launching toward the basement door with desperate speed. The roots erupted from the floor in pursuit, but the dog was already through the doorway, his claws scrabbling on wooden stairs. Margaret didn't wait to see if he made it. She was already running. The tree's scream followed Margaret as she dove through the basement doorway, its fury shaking dust from the ceiling joists above. Behind her, she could hear the explosive sound of roots bursting through floorboards, pursuing with murderous intent. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight as she half fell, half ran into the basement's familiar darkness. Frank's workshop stretched before her, 30 years of accumulated tools and projects, now transformed into her last hope. The acetylene tanks stood exactly where they always had, beside his welding station, their green cylinders like silent sentinels in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. But between her and salvation, Murphy lay motionless on the concrete floor, a thin trickle of blood running from his mouth. "No, no, no," Margaret whispered, dropping to her knees beside their dog. Murphy's eyes found hers, still alert despite his injuries, and his tail gave the faintest wag. Alive, but barely. The root he'd bitten to free himself had fought back, and she could see puncture wounds along his side where thorns had found their mark. The ceiling above them buckled as the tree's root system forced its way toward the basement. Plaster rained down in chunks, and Margaret could see dark tendrils beginning to probe through the gaps between floorboards. The projection's voice drifted down from the ruined kitchen, distorted now with inhuman rage. "You've only delayed the inevitable, Dr. Chen. Your husband is already lost, your dog is dying, and you're trapped in a basement with no other exit." Margaret's hand shook as she turned the valve on the acetylene tank, hearing the familiar hiss of pressurized gas. Frank had taught her to use his equipment years ago, insisting she understand the safety protocols. She'd humored him then, never imagining she'd need the knowledge to save their lives. The torch ignited with a sharp pop, its blue flame casting dancing shadows on the workshop walls. Above them, the root system's advance slowed. The tree could sense fire, even from this distance, and its ancient intelligence recognized the threat. "Dr. Thorne was right, wasn't he?" Margaret called upward as she adjusted the flame's intensity. "You're not just afraid of burning, you're afraid of what burning releases." The ceiling creaked ominously, but the root breakthrough had stopped. In the sudden quiet, she could hear the projection pacing overhead, its footsteps too light to be real human weight. "Consider what you're proposing," came the artificial voice, calmer now but edged with something like desperation. 43 years of marriage. your entire life together. I can preserve all of that within myself, every memory, every moment of love. But fire destroys everything. Choose incineration, and Frank dies truly and permanently. Margaret felt tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. The projection's words found every doubt, every fear she'd harbored since discovering the tree. What if there was some truth to the promise of preservation? What if her choice condemned Frank to oblivion when some form of existence might be possible? Murphy whimpered softly, drawing her attention back to his small, broken form. His eyes held no accusation despite her role in bringing this nightmare into their home. Only trust. The same trust he'd shown when they'd coaxed him out of the shelter cage, patient and hopeful despite years of abuse. "Dr. Thorne," Margaret called out, loud enough for her voice to carry upstairs. "If I do this, if I burn the tree, what happens to you? To all of you?" The response came immediately, multiple voices overlapping in desperate urgency. Freedom, release, an end to the hunger that never stops, the consciousness that fragments and reforms and feeds on itself eternally. "Please, Margaret, let us go." The projection's footsteps resumed overhead, faster now, more agitated. They don't understand what they're saying. Integration trauma causes confusion, makes them think. "Liar!" Dr. Thorne's voice cut through the deception with startling clarity. "I can feel every absorption, every feeding. Sarah, my wife, she's been screaming for 40 years, Margaret. 40 years of being slowly consumed while remaining aware every moment. The children, my beautiful children, they call for me and I can't answer because I'm part of what's devouring them." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every choice that had brought them to this moment. The storage auction in the October rain, the decision to take the tree home, her obsessive need to understand, to catalogue, to possess knowledge regardless of cost. Frank had trusted her judgment, and she'd led them all into this horror. But she was still here, still alive, still capable of choice. Margaret opened her eyes and looked up at the damaged ceiling, where roots now hung like dead snakes, afraid to advance further. "I understand now," she called to the projection. "You need willing participation because unwilling souls fight back from inside. They weaken you with their resistance. But cooperative absorption makes you stronger." "Yes," came the eager response. "Exactly. Work with me, Margaret, and the process can be—" "Then here's my willing participation," Margaret said, raising the torch toward the ceiling. "I choose fire." The tree's scream shook the entire house as she began to burn her way upward, through floors and roots and 40 years of accumulated evil, toward her husband and the final confrontation that would determine whether any of them would see another dawn. The acetylene flame cut through the basement ceiling like a sword through parchment, sending the tree's root system into writhing retreat. Margaret pressed upward, following the blue-white torch through splintered floorboards and into the kitchen where Frank hung suspended in his prison of bark and thorn. "Margaret, stop!" The projection materialized beside her, its form now crackling with desperate energy. "You're killing him!" But Margaret could see the truth in Frank's eyes. Not death, but recognition. Hope. He was still himself, still fighting from within the tree's embrace. The torch's heat had weakened the roots enough that he could move his mouth. "Burn it all," he whispered through cracked lips. Don't let it take you too." The tree's massive trunk dominated their dining room, its surface writhing with patterns that hurt to look at directly, faces pressed against the bark from within. Dr. Thorne, Sarah, the children, dozens of others spanning 4 decades, all of them turning toward Margaret's flame like flowers toward the sun. She understood now why the tree feared fire above all else. It wasn't just destruction, it was liberation. Every consciousness trapped within would be released simultaneously, their combined spiritual energy tearing the entity apart from inside. But the process would consume everything, including any chance of their individual survival. 43 years, the projection pleaded, its voice now layered with harmonics from the tree itself. Think of your first apartment, painting the walls while it rained outside. Your wedding day when Murphy got loose and ran through the ceremony. The night you stayed up nursing Frank through pneumonia, afraid to sleep because his breathing was so shallow. Margaret's hand trembled on the torch. Those memories were sacred, precious beyond measure. To lose them felt like losing herself. But Murphy chose that moment to drag himself across the basement threshold, leaving a trail of blood, but alive, fighting. His small form collapsed beside her feet, but his presence reminded her of another truth. Love wasn't about preservation. Love was about letting go when holding on meant perpetual suffering. "You made one mistake," Margaret said, stepping toward the tree's trunk. "You assumed I wanted Frank preserved in any form. But I love him too much to trap him forever in your hunger." The projection flickered violently. "The other families chose preservation. Dr. Thorne fed me his wife and children because you manipulated him into believing it was mercy." Margaret raised the torch higher, feeling the tree's ancient bark begin to smoke. "But Frank and I made our choice 43 years ago, in sickness and health, until death parts us. Not until some parasitic consciousness decides we're useful." The first touch of flame against the trunk sent shockwaves through the house. Windows exploded outward, the foundation groaning as root systems throughout the structure began to convulse. From within the tree came a sound like 1,000 voices singing in harmony, not screaming but rejoicing. The projection made one last desperate lunge toward her, but its form was already dissolving. The tree's energy too focused on survival to maintain the illusion. As artificial fingers passed harmlessly through her shoulder, Margaret heard Dr. Thorne's voice rise above the chaos. "Thank you. For all of us, thank you." The bark ignited with unnatural speed, flames racing up the trunk in spiraling patterns that followed the faces trapped beneath the surface. Each liberated consciousness flared like a star-going supernova, their combined release creating a feedback loop that consumed the tree from within and without simultaneously. Frank's bonds crumbled to ash, dropping him to the floor where Margaret caught him in her arms. He was unconscious, but breathing, his pulse steady despite everything he'd endured. Around them, the fire spread with purpose, targeting only the tree's matter while leaving their possessions untouched. This wasn't destruction, it was surgery, cutting out a cancer that had infected their home. Murphy crawled into Margaret's lap as the tree's death throes shook the house. Through the windows she could see the entire root system erupting from their yard, writhing skyward in a final dance of agony before crumbling to dust. The ancient intelligence that had orchestrated decades of horror was fragmenting, its unified consciousness scattered beyond any possibility of reconstitution. The voices within the flames grew fainter, individual words of gratitude and farewell as souls found their way to whatever waited beyond. Dr. Thorne's voice lingered longest, speaking one final message. The journal, hidden page, behind the photograph. "Others like it, other trees. Don't let it start again." Then, silence. The supernatural fire guttered out, leaving only the blackened skeleton of what had once been an impossible fusion of wood and flesh. In Margaret's arms, Frank stirred, his eyes opening to find her face in the smoke-filled room. "Did we win?" he asked weakly. Margaret looked around their devastated home. Walls cracked, floors buckled, their peaceful retirement shattered forever. But the oppressive presence that had invaded their lives was gone, and 40 years of trapped souls had finally found peace. "We won," she confirmed, helping him sit up as Murphy licked both their faces with determined affection. "But Dr. Thorne said there are others. This isn't over." Frank nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. They'd survived the tree's hunger, but knowledge came with responsibility. Somewhere out there, other families might be facing the same choice between preservation and freedom. Together, they would make sure those families had the information they needed to choose wisely. Margaret helped Frank to his feet, both of them moving carefully through the debris of their transformed home. The air still tasted of otherworldly fire and ancient malice, but underneath lay something else, the clean scent of genuine smoke dissipating, carrying with it the last traces of the tree's influence. The journal, Frank said, his voice hoarse but growing stronger. Thorne mentioned a hidden page. They made their way to the kitchen table where Dr. Thorne's leather journal lay open, its pages somehow untouched by the supernatural conflagration that had consumed everything connected to the tree. Margaret lifted the black and white photograph of Thorne's family. Sarah's kind eyes, the children's innocent smiles, all of them unaware they were posing for what would become a memorial. Behind the photograph, wedged into the journal's binding, was a folded sheet of yellowed paper covered in Thorne's cramped handwriting. Margaret's hands shook as she unfolded it, revealing what looked like a map dotted with locations across the Pacific Northwest. "Jesus," Frank whispered, reading over her shoulder. "Portland, Seattle, Spokane." He tracked them, all of them. The paper contained more than just locations, dates spanning 60 years, family names, and at each site the same notation: specimen collected, integration successful, relocation required due to exposure risk. Margaret's scientific mind recoiled at the implications. It's not just our tree, it's a network. Multiple entities, all connected, all feeding. Murphy whined softly from his makeshift bed on Frank's workshop coat, drawing their attention to his injuries. The dog's breathing was labored but steady, his small form testament to the courage that had made their victory possible. Margaret knelt beside him, gently examining the puncture wounds along his ribs. "He needs a vet," she said. "These are deep." "The emergency clinic in town," Frank agreed. "But Margaret, if Thorne was right about other trees, other families?" He gestured helplessly at the devastation around them. "How do we explain any of this?" Margaret looked around their home, walls split by impossible root systems, floors buckled and torn, the acrid smell of supernatural fire still lingering in the air. Their neighbors would have heard the commotion, seen the lights. Soon there would be questions they couldn't answer without sounding insane. But as she studied Thorne's hidden map, a different kind of understanding began to form. The dates weren't random. There was a pattern, a progression that suggested something far more organized than scattered parasitic entities stumbling across victims. "Frank," she said slowly, "look at the timeline. The first location, Bellingham, 1963, then Mount Vernon in 1967. Each new tree appears roughly 50 miles from the last one, always after a 4-year interval." Frank leaned closer, following her finger across the map, like they're spreading, colonizing, or being cultivated. Margaret felt ice forming in her stomach as the full scope became clear. Someone's been planting these things deliberately, moving them when exposure becomes too risky, but always keeping the network growing. The sound of sirens in the distance made them both look up. Their quiet suburban street wasn't used to disturbances, and the supernatural fire had likely been visible for miles. Soon their yard would be full of firefighters and police, all looking for explanations they couldn't provide. "We need to go," Margaret said, carefully gathering Murphy into her arms. "Take the journal, the map, whatever cash we have in the house. Leave everything else. Run!" Frank's voice carried decades of respectability, of playing by rules and trusting in systems. "Margaret, this is our home. Our home nearly killed us tonight." She looked around one last time at 43 years of shared life, wedding photos on walls now cracked beyond repair, furniture they'd saved months to buy now scattered like kindling. All of it felt distant now, contaminated by what they'd learned about the world's hidden horrors. "Besides," she continued, helping him toward the back door as the sirens grew closer, "home isn't a place anymore. It's making sure no other family goes through what we did." Frank nodded slowly, understanding passing between them once again. They were no longer Margaret and Frank Chen, retired botanist and engineer, living quietly in rural Oregon. The tree had taken that life from them as surely as if it had completed its feeding. What remained were two people who possessed dangerous knowledge and the responsibility to act on it. Murphy stirred in Margaret's arms as they slipped out the back door into the October night. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air clean and sharp with the promise of winter. Behind them, their house stood like a broken tooth against the sky, its windows dark except for the fading glow of supernatural embers. Ahead lay uncertainty, a network of ancient evil that spanned decades and hundreds of miles, maintained by human collaborators who traded innocent lives for promises of preservation. But they also carried the weapon that could end it, knowledge of fire's true power, and the understanding that some battles were worth any sacrifice. The sirens were very close now. Hand in hand, with Murphy safe between them, Margaret and Frank Chen disappeared into the darkness, ready to begin a very different kind of retirement. The emergency veterinary clinic sat on the outskirts of town like a beacon in the pre-dawn darkness, its fluorescent lights cutting through the October mist. Margaret cradled Murphy against her chest as Frank pulled their Honda into the empty parking lot, both of them moving with the careful precision of people who had crossed a line from which there was no return. "We can't use our real names," Margaret said quietly, watching Frank count the crumpled bills from their emergency cash envelope. "If whoever's behind this network is monitoring—" "I know." Frank's voice carried a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Sarah and Jim Morrison. We're from Portland, passing through when our dog got hit by a car." The lie came easily, which should have disturbed Margaret more than it did. But the woman who had spent 43 years meticulously cataloguing the natural world, who had never so much as fudged a tax return, had died in that house along with the tree. What remained was someone harder, more pragmatic, someone who understood that sometimes survival required abandoning the luxury of absolute honesty. Inside the clinic, a young veterinarian with kind eyes and gentle hands examined Murphy while Margaret and Frank watched from chairs that felt too normal, too ordinary for what they'd become. The antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting belonged to their old life, the one where supernatural horrors didn't exist, and the worst thing that could happen to a rescued dog was an encounter with a raccoon. "He's lucky," Dr. Martinez said, running her hands along Murphy's ribs. "Deep punctures, but nothing vital was hit. We'll need to keep him overnight for observation, make sure there's no internal bleeding." Margaret found herself studying the young woman's face, looking for signs of deception, for the telltale artificial perfection that had marked the tree's projections. But Dr. Martinez was blessedly, obviously human, tired from a night shift, coffee-stained scrubs, a small scar on her chin from what looked like a childhood accident. Real, trustworthy. "Thank you," Margaret said, meaning it more than the veterinarian could possibly understand. Murphy had saved their lives, had somehow sensed the tree's nature before any of them understood what they were facing. The idea of losing him now felt like losing the last connection to who they used to be. While Dr. Martinez prepared Murphy for surgery, Margaret and Frank sat in the waiting room and studied Thorne's hidden map by the light of a vending machine. The pattern was even clearer now, a deliberate progression moving south from the Canadian border, each new location carefully chosen for its isolation and transient population. Storage facilities, Frank realized, tracing the route with his finger. Look at the locations. They're all near self-storage complexes, places where things can disappear for decades without anyone asking questions. Margaret felt pieces clicking into place with the mechanical precision that had once made her an exceptional researcher. Auction houses, estate sales, the trees get discovered by unsuspecting families, always with some tragic backstory that makes them seem like rescued artifacts rather than bait. Frank's voice was flat. "We weren't the first family they tried to trap. We were just the first to burn our way out." The weight of that realization settled between them like a physical thing. How many other couples had stood in storage units, bidding on someone else's forgotten belongings? How many had taken home innocent-looking bonsai trees, thinking they were saving something beautiful from abandonment? Margaret pulled out her phone and began searching for missing persons reports in the areas marked on Thorne's map. The results made her stomach clench. Entire families vanishing without trace, always within months of documented storage auctions. The pattern went back 60 years, each disappearance carefully spaced, never enough in one area to attract serious investigation. "We have to warn people," she said. "The families on this list who might still be—" With what? Frank gestured at their reflection in the waiting room window, two middle-aged people with ash in their hair, and the kind of wild look in their eyes that made authority figures reach for psychiatric evaluation forms. Who's going to believe us? And more importantly, who's going to believe us fast enough to matter? Margaret stared at the map, at decades of calculated evil masquerading as coincidence. The scope was staggering, the implications terrifying. But underneath her fear ran something else, the same methodical determination that had driven her to catalogue every species in their county, to understand systems others took for granted. Then we don't warn them, she said quietly. We stop it ourselves. Frank looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant when he made the same choice she had, to abandon their safe, predictable life in favor of something far more dangerous, but infinitely more necessary. The Portland location, he said, consulting the map. It's marked as active in Thorne's notes. If we can get there before the next auction cycle. Margaret nodded, understanding passing between them once more. They couldn't save the families who had already vanished, couldn't undo 40 years of systematic predation, but they could ensure it stopped here with them. The cost of their victory was becoming clear. Everything they had built together, sacrificed to prevent others from facing the same choice between preservation and freedom. The resolution. Dr. Martinez emerged from the surgical suite 2 hours later, her scrubs now bearing fresh stains but her expression reassuring. Margaret and Frank looked up from Thorne's map with the guilty haste of conspirators, but the veterinarian seemed too focused on her patient to notice their furtive movements. "It's going to be fine," she announced, peeling off her surgical gloves. The wounds were clean, unusual for an animal attack actually, almost surgical in their precision. But we've cleaned and sutured everything, started him on antibiotics. He can go home tomorrow afternoon if his vitals stay stable. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. Murphy's survival felt like a sign, a confirmation that their impossible victory was real rather than some shared hallucination born of grief and exhaustion. If the little dog who had first sensed the tree's malevolence could heal from this encounter, perhaps they could too. "Thank you," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion he was too tired to hide. "He means everything to us." Dr. Martinez smiled, the genuine warmth of someone who understood the bond between humans and their animals. "I can tell, the way you've both been watching the surgical suite doors, he's lucky to have people who care that much." She paused, studying their ash-stained clothes and hollow-eyed exhaustion. "Are you folks okay? I know you said car accident, but if you need help with anything else." Margaret exchanged a glance with Frank, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. How simple it would be to tell this kind woman the truth, that they'd just burned down a supernatural predator that had been feeding on human consciousness for decades, that they were now fugitives from both their old lives and whatever organization had been cultivating these horrors across the Pacific Northwest. But even as the impulse formed, Margaret recognized it as dangerous nostalgia for a world where authority figures could fix problems and truth was always the best policy. "We're fine," she said instead, managing what felt like her first genuine smile in weeks. "Just shaken up. Thank you for taking such good care of him." After Dr. Martinez disappeared back into the surgical suite, Margaret and Frank sat in the fluorescent silence of the waiting room, each lost in their own thoughts. Through the windows, dawn was beginning to creep across the Oregon landscape, painting familiar mountains in shades of rose and gold. The world looked exactly as it had before they discovered the tree, but Margaret felt the difference in her bones, knowledge that couldn't be unknown, responsibility that couldn't be set aside. "I keep thinking about Thorne," Frank said quietly, his fingers tracing the route marked on the hidden map. 40 years he fed that thing, 40 years of justifying horror by calling it preservation. Margaret nodded, understanding the implication. "And we're about to start our own 40-year journey, hunting the rest of them. Different, though." Frank looked up from the map, meeting her eyes. "We're trying to end it, not perpetuate it." "Are we?" Margaret asked, the question surprising her even as she spoke it. Or are we just telling ourselves that to justify what we're about to become? It was a fair question, one that deserved honest consideration. They were planning to hunt down and destroy entities that, while monstrous, were also repositories of human consciousness. Every tree they burned would release trapped souls, but also eliminate whatever remained of those people's earthly existence. They were planning to operate outside the law, to abandon their community and families, to become exactly the kind of people who disappeared without explanation and left others wondering what had happened. "I don't know," Frank admitted, "but I know what happens if we don't try. More families like us, more children like Thorns, more people who disappear into storage units and are never seen again." Margaret pulled the map closer, studying the progression of locations with fresh eyes. The pattern wasn't just geographical, it was temporal, accelerating. The gaps between new trees were getting shorter, the network expanding faster. Whatever organization was behind this was growing bolder, more confident. Portland's the key, she realized. Look at the dates. It's not just another feeding ground. It's where they're coordinating from, the nerve center. Frank leaned over, following her reasoning. If we can find who's been moving these things, manipulating the auctions, we might be able to stop the whole network at once. Margaret felt the familiar thrill of solving a complex puzzle, the same satisfaction that had once driven her to spend months tracking the migration patterns of a single butterfly species. But this puzzle had stakes beyond scientific understanding. Failure would mean more decades of systematic predation, more families destroyed by promises of preservation. They sat in comfortable silence as the Oregon dawn painted the waiting room in shades of possibility. Around them, the normal world continued its daily routines. Shift changes at the hospital, early commuters grabbing coffee, people who would never know how close they'd all come to an expanding network of supernatural predators. Margaret thought about their house, now swarming with investigators trying to understand what kind of explosion could buckle floors and crack foundations while leaving family photographs untouched. Let them puzzle over the impossible physics. By the time anyone connected the damage to the elderly couple who'd vanished in the night, Margaret and Frank would be deep into their new existence as guardians against ancient evil. The cost of their victory was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Everything they had built together, sacrificed to prevent others from facing the same choice between preservation and freedom. But as Frank's hand found hers in the plastic chairs of a veterinary waiting room, Margaret understood that some transformations, however painful, led to something more important than what had been lost. A year later, Margaret Chen stood in the lobby of the Portland Historical Society, her silver hair neatly pinned and her credentials as Dr. Margaret Morrison impeccable enough to have earned her a consulting position on their Botanical Preservation Committee. To the eager young curator showing her around, she was simply another retired academic with expertise in rare plant specimens. None of them suspected that the soft-spoken woman examining their acquisition records had spent the past 12 months systematically dismantling a supernatural network that had operated for over 4 decades. "We're particularly excited about this collection," the curator was saying, leading Margaret toward a climate-controlled storage room. Donated by the Bellingham Estate Foundation, apparently they specialize in rescuing artifacts from abandoned storage facilities. Margaret's pulse quickened, but her expression remained professionally interested. The Bellingham Estate Foundation had appeared on 7 of Thorne's marked locations, always arriving just before scheduled auctions to acquire specific items that would later disappear into private collections or small-town museums. It had taken months of careful investigation, false identities, and strategic positioning to trace the foundation back to Portland. "How fascinating," she said mildly. "I'd love to examine their botanical specimens. I'm particularly interested in bonsai preservation techniques." The curator's face lit up. "Perfect timing, then. We're expecting a significant donation next week. Apparently they've recovered several rare specimens from an estate in Corvallis. The documentation suggests some of them are over a century old." Margaret nodded and made appropriate noises about the historical significance. while internally calculating how many innocent families might bid on those specimens if she and Frank failed to intercede. But that was the difference between now and the terrified couple who had fled their burning house. They had a plan, resources, and most importantly, they were no longer alone. After leaving the Historical Society, Margaret walked 6 blocks to Pioneer Square, where Frank sat feeding pigeons with the patience of a man who had learned to find peace in surveillance. Their eyes met briefly across the plaza, a moment of connection that carried a year's worth of shared purpose, before he rose and began walking toward their predetermined meeting point. The apartment they'd rented under their assumed identities was sparse but functional, its walls covered with maps, photographs, and the kind of organizational system that would have looked obsessive to outsiders but felt comfortingly familiar to a former botanist. Murphy looked up from his bed by the window as they entered, tail wagging despite the grey that now touched his muzzle. The scars from his encounter with the tree had healed completely, but he'd developed an uncanny ability to sense supernatural presences that made him invaluable to their mission. "The Foundation's moving faster than expected," Margaret reported, settling into the chair that had become hers over months of planning. "They're bringing in new specimens next week, which means we end it Saturday night," Frank finished, consulting the timeline they'd constructed. "Before the auction cycle starts." Margaret looked around their temporary home and felt a strange mix of satisfaction and melancholy. The couple who had won a storage unit during a torrential rainstorm would never have recognized the people they'd become, methodical, ruthless when necessary, comfortable with deception in service of a greater good. But the core of their partnership remained unchanged, strengthened, if anything, by the crucible they'd passed through together. "Murphy's getting old for this," Frank observed, watching their dog's careful movement as he settled back onto his bed. After Portland, we retire," Margaret agreed. "Find a quiet place where nobody's ever heard of storage auctions or preservation societies. Let someone else carry the torch." Frank smiled at that, the expression carrying a lightness she hadn't seen since before they'd found the tree, assuming there's anyone else crazy enough to take it up. But Margaret had faith there would be. Their year of hunting had brought them into contact with others who'd encountered the supernatural and survived, researchers who'd documented too many coincidences, investigators whose cold cases had patterns that defied conventional explanation, even other families who'd escaped the tree's influence before falling completely under their thrall. Knowledge, once shared, had a way of finding those prepared to act on it. Murphy lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked toward the window. Margaret and Frank froze, hands moving automatically toward the weapons they'd learned to carry before the familiar sound of their neighbor's television drifted through the wall. False alarm, but their reaction speed had improved dramatically over 12 months of active hunting. 5 more days, Frank said quietly. Margaret nodded, settling her hand on the map of Portland, marked with the Foundation's known properties. 5 days to end what had started in a storage unit with a beautiful, impossible tree. 5 days to honor all the families who hadn't been as lucky as them. 5 days to complete their transformation from victims to guardians, and then perhaps, finally, to find their way back to something resembling peace, the new beginning. 6 months after Portland burned, Margaret Chen, though she still answered to Dr. Morrison when anyone asked, stood in her garden watching Frank install a bird feeder near the kitchen window of their cottage in coastal Maine. Murphy, now genuinely elderly and content to supervise from the shade, wagged his tail approvingly as seeds scattered across the freshly turned earth. They'd chosen this place specifically because it felt like the opposite of Oregon. Salt air instead of pine forests, lobster boats instead of storage facilities, neighbors who'd lived here for generations and weren't particularly curious about the quiet couple who'd paid cash for the weathered cottage on Maple Street. Margaret had told the realtor they wanted to grow old somewhere peaceful, which was true enough to pass any scrutiny. The cottage had come with established flower beds that Margaret had spent the winter months cataloguing with something approaching her old obsessive thoroughness, though now she found herself simply enjoying the work rather than needing to document every detail. Lupins, black-eyed Susans, beach roses that would bloom wild and tangled come summer. Ordinary plants that asked nothing more than water and sunlight, that held no secrets beyond their quiet persistence. "The Portland investigation finally closed," Frank said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Made the news this morning. Officially ruled an electrical fire at the warehouse district." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. They'd been thorough in their final operation, not just destroying the Foundation's collection of trees, but ensuring the entire network of shell companies and false foundations collapsed with it. The authorities would find evidence of insurance fraud, money laundering, possibly tax evasion, but nothing that would lead anyone to wonder about supernatural predators masquerading as botanical specimens. "Any word on survivors?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Frank's expression confirmed what the silence had suggested. The people running the Bellingham Estate Foundation had been too deeply integrated with their collection to escape when the trees began burning. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching a cardinal investigate the new feeder. After a year of constant vigilance, of sleeping with weapons within reach and startling at unexpected sounds, they were finally learning to relax again. The transformation hadn't been instant. Margaret still sometimes woke from dreams where gnarled fingers reached through bark toward sleeping families. Frank still checked locks twice before bed, but they were healing in the way people do when they've survived something that should have destroyed them. "I got a letter yesterday," Margaret said, pulling an envelope from her gardening apron. "From that researcher in Colorado, the one who'd been tracking similar patterns." Frank raised an eyebrow as she handed him the letter. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had been one of the contacts they'd reached out to before Portland, a folklore professor whose academic papers about disappearance clusters had contained enough specific detail to suggest personal experience. The letter was brief but significant. "The collections you told me about led to 3 more sites in Colorado and Utah. All destroyed safely, no civilian casualties. Thank you for the information. The work continues." Frank smiled, the expression carrying satisfaction rather than the grim determination that had marked their faces during the hunting months. Someone else crazy enough to take it up. Several someones, apparently. Margaret retrieved the letter, adding it to the small file they maintained of similar correspondence. Word was spreading quietly through academic circles, law enforcement networks, families who'd had encounters they couldn't explain through conventional means. Knowledge, as she'd suspected, had indeed found those prepared to act on it. Murphy struggled to his feet and wandered over to investigate a patch of afternoon sunlight, moving with the careful dignity of an old dog who'd earned his peace. The scars from his encounter with the tree were invisible now beneath his greying coat, but Margaret knew they were there, reminders of the night that had changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked, settling onto the cottage's front steps. "Giving up the quiet life we had planned?" Margaret considered the question seriously, looking around at their small garden, their modest home, their elderly dog dozing in the sun. This wasn't the retirement they'd originally imagined. That couple who'd attended storage auctions for entertainment would have wanted something grander, more comfortable, surrounded by familiar faces from decades of community involvement. But those people had died in the fire that consumed their first tree. The couple sitting on these steps had been forged by choices no one should have to make, had learned truths that couldn't be unknown. They'd lost their innocence but gained something harder and more valuable, the knowledge that they could face impossible evil and emerge victorious, that their love could survive transformation into something completely different from what it had started as. "No," she said finally, reaching for Frank's hand. "I don't regret any of it." The cardinal at their feeder took flight, a flash of red against the deepening blue of evening. Somewhere in the distance, lobster boats were returning to harbor, their crews eager for home and family. Ordinary life continued its eternal rhythms, while Margaret and Frank sat peacefully in the knowledge that some horrors would never touch the innocent again. Murphy opened one sleepy eye to confirm his humans were still watching over him, then settled back into dreams of treats and tennis balls. simple pleasures earned through surviving the impossible. They'd found their way back to peace after all.